Welcome to the Apex Energy Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Al-Qattan. Today, my guest is Dr. Max Gulhane. Dr. Gulhane is a medical doctor and a general practice registrar or internal medicine doctor with a passion for preventative health lifestyle solutions to modern diseases. He's the host of the Regenerative Health Podcast, where he invites experts on to discuss the subjects like regenerative farming, low-carb diets, and circadian health. How are you, Dr. Gulhane?
Hey Sam, good. Thank you, mate. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, good. Is there anything you want to just add on to that introduction? Anything you want to mention to the listeners?
Not really. That seems pretty good. Yeah, general practice is family medicine. So, what you guys call family medicine. So, yeah, not internal medicine. So, just to be really specific, but yeah, no, that sounds great.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of start off with the low carb diet thing. Why would someone want to start to do a low carb or a zero carb diet? How would that help them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And most commonly, I've used low carb diets to help people who have metabolic diseases. So, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, polycystic ovary syndrome, um, all the obesity, all these diseases that we know that are related to insulin resistance respond incredibly well to a low carbohydrate diet. And what that looks like in practice is essentially getting the daily amount of carbohydrates that we ingest down to ideally below 20 grams per day. And if we're thinking about a therapeutic approach, which is what we need to really reverse someone's problem disease, then that's the limit that we see as consistently beneficial. So low carb it's very simple. It's nothing fancy, but it can be incredibly powerful. And typically people with type 2 diabetes who um, even who are up to injecting exogenous insulin. So what I mean by that is that there's a spectrum of disease when we think about metabolic disease, and on the mildest end of that metabolic disease is people who are perhaps are mildly leptin resistant. So their body's a little bit unsure about how much energy it's got on board. So they've got dysregulation of their appetite. They're hungry all the time. That's kind of the mildest implication, and then they become a little bit insulin resistant. So their body, what that means is the tissues, the metabolic tissues of their body, like their liver, like their muscle, become resistant to the effects of insulin on the body. So their fat tissue are less able to take up energy. The liver's less responsive to the effect of insulin, which turns off gluconeogenesis or making glucose, so that they can be mildly insulin resistant and all the way, and that spectrum continues all the way to florid type 2 diabetes, where someone's been insulin resistant for a period of decades, and they essentially have lost their pancreas has essentially burnt out, and they're actually not producing as much insulin anymore because their pancreas has been under so much stress for so many years. So just for the listener, that's kind of the spectrum of metabolic disease, and people can be sitting on all kinds of different positions on that spectrum. And I mentioned obesity and polycystic ovary disease because perhaps your listeners might be a little bit younger, or maybe they have parents that have type 2 diabetes. But basically the disease process starts very, very early, and it starts with the deposition of what's called visceral fat or ectopic fat. And what happens is when we exceed our body's ability to store our energy with inside our white adipose tissue under our skin, which is our subcutaneous fat. And we can talk exactly why that might that be the case. But when we, for a various number of reasons, exceed that storage capacity, then this energy and this fat starts spilling out and getting deposited in other areas. And the areas that it can be deposited most commonly are the liver. So you get fat inside the liver, which is known as metabolic associated fatty liver disease or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And then it can also spill out into the muscle, and people can get fatty muscle, which looks like a marble steak. It can spill out into deposits inside the abdomen. So not only within organs, but within spaces that it shouldn't be. So visceral fat is fat within the abdominal cavity. So you get the deposition of visceral fat is some of the earliest signs that the metabolic system of the body is going wrong. And then that accompanies, or that also gets marked by, your rise of your body's fasting insulin level. So these are just some of the markers that people can recognize in terms of their body's metabolism going wrong. So most people are on the spectrum, and there was a study recently done that showed that 88% of Americans have at least one marker of metabolic dysfunction, and that includes things like high blood pressure or raised waist circumference, high fasting triglyceride levels, low high density lipoprotein. So there's these criteria that make up what's known as the metabolic syndrome, and if you have three of them, then you've got the metabolic syndrome, and you're on your way to getting these type 2 diabetes. But the study showed that at least at 88% of Americans had at least one of these markers. So what that's telling us is that the vast majority of people in your country and in my country too, in Australia, are not metabolically healthy. And what I mean by that is that they've got one of these markers. They're on the road to getting type 2 diabetes. They're on the road to metabolic syndrome. And that is putting them at higher risk of all these. Essentially, I explain it, the diseases that you see in people, in a nursing home. So in a care home, things like heart attacks. I've already mentioned type 2 diabetes, dementia, stroke, cancer, all these like downstream effects that we don't want to get. They all start decades earlier in the form of insulin resistance. So at the core, the low carb diet is one of the most simple ways to turn the car around, like do a U-turn and stop us from going towards these very undesirable health effects by simply just keeping the carbohydrate under 20 grams, and therefore eating a lot more fat and protein. Because when you lower that one macronutrient, you need to increase the other two. And it's incredibly effective, and people seem to be able to sustain that as a lifestyle change into the long term. And as I mentioned, they can come off medications, they can reduce their insulin dose, or they can even come off insulin. If they're an insulin dependent type 2 diabetic, they can come off a range of injectable medications, and the things like semaglutide or Ozempic. The effect that we see with a low carb diet is the Ozempic effect is mimicking what we get on a low carb diet, only it doesn't come with all those side effects. So that's low carb in a nutshell. I actually believe it should be being practiced by every single family medicine and internal medicine doctor in the world. There is no reason why this shouldn't be the first line intervention for anyone who's coming through a family medicine clinic or a hospital with a raised waist circumference or one of those signs of metabolic dysfunction. They need to be prescribed a low carb diet, and they're not at the moment. And again, we can go into the reasons why that's not the case, but it's a very effective, and it's a very easy and effective way of treating and reversing metabolic diseases.
Yeah, and to add on to that for the listener, psychiatric disorders now in the field of metabolic psychiatry, you've heard of it with Dr. Chris Palmer. Yeah,
yes,
it's all links back to metabolic dysfunction. I do actually want to ask, why isn't this a contemporary answer? I mean, if you go up to any doctor now, even in the United States, they won't give you this kind of answer. Why is that? Why is this not talked about?
That's a very, very good question. And if we want to go all the way back to the beginning, it started in the late 1800s with the Seventh-day Adventist religious movement, and they have they basically have a religious doctrine that specifies or stipulates a vegan diet, and they have a what's known as a Garden of Eden diet, which is plants, nuts, seeds, fruits, and vegetables. And this diet was ordained or discussed and prescribed by their prophetess, a lady called Ellen G. White, and they believe that if people were to eat this diet, then it would reduce their passions. And what that effectively means is it would minimize the likelihood that they would be masturbating. And that is definitely the case, because when you restrict meat and animal sources of fat, like full cream, or like full fat butter, animal fat, from the diet, you stop providing the body with fat soluble vitamins, which are cholesterol, which are the precursors to make sex steroid hormones. So your libido definitely goes down if you eat a vegan diet, and that was in the intended effect. So essentially, what happened is these people were extremely activists in their belief and their approach, and they founded the American Dietetics Association back in the 1920s or 30s, I believe, and started writing all the books about dietetics. So it was, have you heard of Nassim Taleb by any chance? So Nassim Taleb wrote, he wrote, he's got a chapter called The Intransigent Minority, and the rule of the intolerant minority. And it's essentially, you only need a very, very small number of people who are fanatically obsessed to be able to change the preferences kind of a whole society. So the Seventh-day Adventists were the intolerant minority of nutrition and dietetics, because they had this divine religious belief that their savior of the planet, or their salvation and the salvation of everyone else, was contingent upon people avoiding eating meat. So they were the ones who promulgated these religious ideas that then pervaded into the mainstream. So fast forward all the way up to the 1977, and that was when the first edition of the US dietary guidelines came out, and it was called the McGovern Report. And it was written in response to as well. It was written in response to the fact that coronary heart disease, or atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, was rising in incidence. And there was a kind of a confluence of interests. There was Ansel Keys, who was a physiologist who was promoting a cholesterol hypothesis, or that cholesterol was behind heart disease. And there was some food industry. There was Procter and Gamble and Crisco, who were making seed oils, or hydrogenated cotton seed oil, and there were the Adventists. So there's it was like a group of different people, like different interests, who all kind of won by throwing red meat and saturated fat under the bus. And essentially, the McGovern Report enshrined a low animal meat, low saturated fat diet into the dietary guidelines. And one of the people that wrote that McGovern Report was a Seventh-day Adventist. So that was the point at which this became recommended for most people. And then every subsequent dietary guidelines in America have continued that higher carb, higher grain, high fruit and nut, and lower animal fat approach. And essentially, the body that dictates or recommends diets for diabetes simply is just an extension, or an extension of that low fat ideology, and that is why diabetics and people in clinical medicine in your country and my country and everywhere are advised to eat a higher carbohydrate diet, even though it is the exact thing that they shouldn't be doing. It's the exact thing that worsens their disease, that increases their requirements for injecting exogenous insulin. And again, the pharmaceutical industry are kind of a part of this as well, because if everyone was doing low carbohydrate diet, then the need for injectable, non-injectable diabetic medications would literally reduce by a factor of 10. So wow. There's a lot of interests that are benefited by keeping people eating a high carb diet, and I haven't even mentioned the food industry and the grain industries, because they make a lot of money too. So yeah, that those are the reasons why low carb isn't the first line diet for the treatment of metabolic diseases.
Yeah, and it's really believable, honestly, because we can maybe even tie this into the farming industry, right? And agriculture, right? Do we see a similar kind of thing where these, a large amount of entities just completely ignore health for the sake of profit?
Yeah, yeah, and the recommendations for those dietary guidelines also had input from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and there are a whole bunch of reasons for that. But essentially, we're getting recommendations that are good for industry and not good for us as patients and individuals. So that's the reality that we need to deal with, and it can be a tough pill for many people to swallow because they like to think that these edicts and these guidelines are in everyone's best interests. But it's unfortunately that's actually a bit of a naive position. And if we're really thinking skeptically and critically, because that's what you have to do when you advocate for yourself and your loved ones, and you find out that those guidelines and these treatment recommendations are good for industries that make the processed food, that grow the grain, that make the insulin, that make the semaglutide, and that's why we're seeing expansion of the use of those injectable GLP-1 agonists into younger and younger people. And there's this constant normalization of obesity, that it's just genetics. And that is the kind of the most pervasive lie in terms of narratives that are being promulgated at the moment, is that it's all genetic, and the little Johnny's, it's not his fault. He was always destined to be obese, and there's no emphasis on the fact that there's massive overconsumption of carbohydrate, sugar, and seed oil based foods, and it's just again more convenient for the established financial and moneyed interests to have people on their injectable medication rather than to lose that weight eating meat and not needing it. So yeah, it's there's a lot going on, and it's difficult for the average person because they're getting such mixed messages from various people. But like I said, I use the low carb diet in my clinical practice, and it is extremely effective. And I really hope that more and more doctors start taking it up.
Amazing. And is there a connection to cancer as well and cancer treatment with low carb diets as well? Because obviously you hear the red meat causes cancer argument constantly.
Yeah, so there's slightly different, two separate issues from, I guess we could talk about the red meat causes cancer really briefly. Essentially, there was an IARC, which was an arm of the World Health Organization, deemed red meat as unprocessed red meat is probably carcinogenic in 2017. And that was on the back of a analysis of the scientific literature. And there's been some great kind of breakdowns of this whole issue, and it could be a whole podcast on itself. But to distill it down, there was they looked at a whole bunch of literature. They chose a smaller subset of that entire literature. So most of the literature just had a null finding, meaning that there's no association between bowel or any type of cancer and unprocessed red meat. But the committee, who themselves were biased and had Adventist leanings, undisclosed conflicts of interest, religious conflicts of interest, decided to look at a small subset of the literature. Again, selectively chose studies that had a positive finding, and then kind of instituted this recommendation of probably carcinogenic. And that even if we put the religiosity and all that aside, the type of evidence that they're basing it on, which is observational nutritional epidemiology, is not it's not sufficient to draw a causal claim, and that's fundamentally because of the nature of the research type. It's none of it is randomized trial data, and again, it's very difficult with a nutritional intervention to get that type of data. But it's simply not even sufficient in the magnitude of the finding to even credibly kind of deem a causal claim. So the claim of unprocessed meat and bowel cancer simply is that it's not worth the paper it's printed on, and it's not in any way a valid or rigorous scientific finding. And if we even step back for a moment and put our just common sense hat on, why would something that humans have been eating for literally millions of years now be the cause of their disease? And there's stable isotope data, which is a form of paleoanthropology that looks at the accumulation of different isotopes in anthropological substances, and it can basically plot a trophic level or a food chain based on the bioaccumulation of these isotopes, and it basically showed that at one point in the Pleistocene era, humans were Homo, I believe Homo erectus, were a hypercarnivore. They were eating bears, they were eating wolves, we were eating all these other carnivorous animals. So there's a deeply imprinted genetic signature of carnivory, into our DNA, and to propose that now that is somehow causing bowel cancer is preposterous. And then when you look at the things that I mentioned with regard to the flimsiness of the scientific methodology, the undisclosed conflicts of interest from the Seventh-day Adventists, then you really just can't. You really need to throw out that claim, and that's what I say to my patients. It's not worth looking into. I mean, processed meat is a different story, and of course, I advocate for the consumption of no processed food at all, whether that's processed meat or anything else. But again, we're talking about unprocessed red meat, like a grass-fed regenerative steak is not going to be harming you. And to claim that is the case I think is going to do a lot of damage, and has done a lot of damage, in the same way that telling people eggs were harmful. They're just a succession of essentially lies that are causing immense damage to public health, because when you remove a source of high quality protein and fat from the diet, like unprocessed red meat, then it gets inevitably replaced with high energy processed foods, and people consume things like seed oil rich fries and everything else. So that's kind of my point on red meat. And to answer your question about insulin resistance and cancer, there's definitely a very, very established link, and there's multiple mechanisms, but essentially cancer is a disease of broken mitochondria and broken energy production. And that's essentially what happens when you get type 2 diabetes, and on that insulin resistance scale is that your body's energy handling mechanisms start malfunctioning, and the presence of insulin, the hormone insulin, which your body is going to have in abundance when we're insulin resistant, is a very potent growth factor for cells. So to have that surrounding your body or circulating for decades on time, at the same time as doing a lot of the behaviors that people do when they're also not metabolically well, is you're providing a pretty fertile ground for cancer growth. So we can see people, and again, this is evidenced by people. There's good evidence that going on ketogenic diets can improve a range of outcomes in patients that do unfortunately get cancer. So it is a powerful adjunctive therapy as well. So if the listener is interested, I'd really refer them to the work of Dr. Thomas Seyfried, who is basically one of the leading in Boston, I believe, who's the leading researcher kind of in this field.
Okay. And speaking in terms of quality of meat, what's the difference between a regenerative grass-fed steak, like you're saying, and just like a normal steak, let's say?
So it comes down to this really simple concept of, was the animal eating what it was supposed to eat? And was the animal eating what it evolved to eat? And just like humans, we talked about low carb for the first part of this interview. When humans eat low carb, their diseases go away. So it really points to the universality of a lower carb diet in human or higher meat diet in human evolution, because when we stop eating those foods, then our disease improve. So the same goes with ruminant herbivores, is that when you feed the ruminant herbivore what it evolved to eat, which is essentially grass and not grain, not corn, not any type of grain that's been grown, sprayed with glyphosate as part of genetically modifying raising grain. And when you feed that animal what it was evolved to eat, you get the healthiest meat. And that's related to things like the omega-3 to 6 ratio and a range of other kind of metrics of animal or meat quality. And so essentially it comes to that. It's that simple. I'm not too specific, and I think if people are very sick, then they should eat whatever steak or meat they can get their hands on. And if that's a feedlot fed or grain fed beef, then that is what it is. It's still going to be 100 times better than eating food from like seed oils or grains or any of the other foods. And the fact is that animal transforms that those grains. So, but essentially, if we can eat an animal that's eaten what it should be eating, we're going to be healthier.
Okay, amazing. I'd love to just transition. I really want to hear your thoughts on quantum biology, light, circadian health, and non-native EMFs. What is essentially a non-native EMF or electromagnetic frequency, and what are some of the dangers that are associated with it?
Yeah, so again, I like to keep it really simple. And if you think about our evolution on time on Earth, our organism was exposed to a very quite a narrow and predictable set of radiation on that electromagnetic spectrum. So if you think about light is just one band of electromagnetic radiation that is being emitted from the sun, and the visible light spectrum is about 380 to just over 700, around 700 nanometers, which essentially means that the energy is within that narrow band is what we can see as visible. And below that is ultraviolet, extending down to just over 200 for UVA. And then above that, we've got near infrared, and that goes a lot higher. Essentially, that is what that's the terrestrial electromagnetic signature that we evolved with. And what that means is that our body has mechanisms to deal with that type of radiation. And things like if we're exposed to ultraviolet light, then our body's evolved mechanisms to mitigate, to protect ourselves from ultraviolet B light, things like developing melanin and a range of other kind of physiological defense mechanisms. So what happens is that when we invented the electricity grid and then subsequently developed radio and telecommunications and now Wi-Fi and 5G communications, then what we did is we managed to make a source of radiation that we were not accustomed to from an evolutionary point of view. So we haven't adapted or developed the mechanisms to deal with that radiation in the same way that we have of the terrestrial sunlight and the other ones that forms of radiation that hit the Earth. So it essentially plays havoc with our physiology in a range of subtle ways. And the most common rebuttal to the idea of the harm of non-native EMF is that it is not ionizing, so therefore can't cause DNA strand breaks. And what that means is that ionizing radiation, which is what we use in X-ray or what you get when you're exposed to nuclear radiation is basically cause breaks in the DNA, and that is how it causes cancer. And industry and people and the entities that are making all these high-speed telecommunications networks kind of insist that there's an absence of evidence of harm. Again, another Taleb concept. Absence of evidence of harm isn't evidence of absence of harm, and they insist that it's safe for those reasons. But what it's doing is it's essentially causing a massive amount of oxidative stress in the body, and it's interfering with the way the mitochondria, which are those tiny little ancestral ancient bacteria that live inside every one of your cells to help you produce energy or harness energy. It's interfering with how they function, and it causes oxidative stress, and it causes mitochondrial dysfunction in a range of mechanisms. But essentially you get it influences the calcium channels in the cell, and they stay open longer than they should, and the outcome is things like reactive oxygen species and reactive nitrogen species. So your body has to soak up a whole bunch of antioxidants to maintain its essentially homeostasis when it's exposed to these non-native EMFs. And another mechanism, which is again getting closer to what you mentioned about the quantum biology, is that it interferes with the body's ability to maintain this exclusion zone water, which is a special type of water that gets used inside the body, essentially a biological on biological surfaces, and within the cell we have an alignment of the water molecules that allow it to everything to function properly, and the non-native EMFs essentially interfere with that process. So, not to get too technical for your audience, but essentially, again, let's keeping it simple. Is this is an part of the electromagnetic spectrum that we didn't evolve next to. So, for those reasons, I believe it's important to avoid exposure to and avoid use or close use of them to your body.
So what does that include? Is that just Wi-Fi, or is that electrical devices in general?
Yeah, so there's different types of I guess you could call electro smog or electro pollution. There's magnetic, there's electrical, there's radio frequency. So to minimize them, it's essentially to get rid of devices, things like so I talked to Tristan Scott, who's an electrical engineer, and he has a great summary. But essentially, inside, so we can start with our body. So any wearable devices we want to minimize, things like the earpods you're wearing, wearable watches. So anything like devices, QR, VR headsets, anything that's on us that's emitting a electromagnetic field, they need to go. And then it's about things like our phone. If we're using a phone, then put it on airplane mode if we're having it close to our body. And then in our environment, don't put our laptop on our lap. And there's established evidence that exposure to cell phone radiation will impair your fertility. And then all the way up to turn the Wi-Fi router off at nighttime, unplug your appliances from your bedroom wall, and don't sleep next to the meter if it's outside your bedroom, or move a fridge away from the wall. So these are all the various things that you can do.
So it really just sounds like damage control at this point. I mean, we're surrounded by all this technology. I mean, is there any way to kind of block this non-native EMF, or it just seems like we have to mitigate it as much as possible?
Yeah, you're right. And look, I'm no expert on EMF mitigation or prevention, but I agree that it's ubiquitous at this point. And there's a range of measures, but essentially dealing with the sources that are getting emitted inside your house is the most easy thing that you can do, and easy thing that you can control. And the basically the distance away, so the distance that you can get away from these sources is disproportionately beneficial, because I believe it's called the inverse square law. There's a factor of 4 that applies, so that as your distance away increases, the benefit or the harm is non-linearly better. So to get rid of them inside, and then to look at your external sources, and then people hardwire their house. They can apply all kinds of mitigating fabrics or wallpapers, and I'm no expert on that, but it depends. And look, some people are more sensitive than others, but as a general rule, I encourage people to avoid.
Okay. Yeah, I really hope more people kind of embrace this narrative, because RFK was recently on the Joe Rogan Experience talking about 5G radiation, everything you're telling me, and people just completely saw him as a kook, just like he just sounds like a crazy conspiracy theorist. But no, there's seems to be a lot of dense literature behind it, which I'm excited to check out. I just wanted to move on to circadian health. What are some practices someone can do to ensure they benefit or maximize their circadian health?
Yeah, look, so essentially the circadian rhythm is this internal kind of timing mechanism that we all evolved to align our bodies or program our body's functions in relation to the solar day. So if you can imagine that in our pasts and even today, there's such dramatic change in the light and energy kind of availability between day and night, that any organism that was able to adapt a system to help them program their hormone secretion, their food-seeking behavior, anything like that, to the night and day cycle was going to survive. So that's why circadian rhythms are so pervasive, or so ubiquitous within the biological systems. But the thing about these endogenous or these internal rhythms is that they're not quite 24 hours. So we need to constantly program them. We constantly need to synchronize them with the external cues in the environment, and the main ones are light. So light is the main, what's called Zeitgeber or time giver, which means it is the chief environmental input that tells our body what time it is. And the way that we receive that signal is by absorbing or receiving light through our eyes and our skin, and that especially the eye message gets transmitted to a very important part of the brain in the hypothalamus, called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and that is like a master clock that then programs or sends information to all these other clocks that are occurring in our other organs, including in our pancreas and our liver and our fat tissue and our muscle and all those metabolic organs that we talked about earlier in the context of insulin resistance. So what happens is that if you look at your iPad at 10 p.m. every night, or you eat dinner at 11, and then you sleep in till 10 a.m. the following day, and you're constantly exposed to artificial light sources, then what happens is that you disrupt that system. So that system relies on complete darkness at night and very bright light during the day, because again, that is what we evolved with. And when you don't do that, so if you're inside all day and you're not getting that bright light exposure, but you expose yourself to very bright light after dark, then you completely throw a big spanner in the works of your circadian rhythm. And you will get the downstream effect of circadian disruption includes mental health diseases, psychiatric problems, neurodevelopmental issues like ADHD, cancer, again, it comes into it, metabolic diseases, obesity, type 2 diabetes, immune problems. So like you'll reduce your body's immune defense, you'll increase the likelihood of autoimmunity. I had one patient who worked as a lab tech for about 5 years. She was going to work before the sun rose. She was indoors under bright white light for the whole day, came home, the sun had already set. She did that for 5 years, and she got MS. And not to say that will happen to everyone who follows that lifestyle, but it is incredibly disruptive to our natural body's rhythm. So you not only immune problems, but everything else. What else have I talked about? Metabolic diseases, psychiatric, they're all downstream cancer. They're downstream of circadian disruption. So to answer your question, I know that was a bit of a long-winded
No, yeah,
prelude.
you're good.
But to what we can do, the highest value is to simply see that morning sun. So before we start the day, before you even reach for your iPhone, go outside, get that circadian download, because the sun is giving you instructions. You just have to be ready to listen, and you have to be ready to see what she's offering. So you have to go outside, get that, see if you can watch the sunrise. That is ideal. Get that information into your eyes to allow you to program all your body's functions. And then throughout the day, if you can check in with the sun, if you go outside, get some more sunlight, again, without sunglasses on, without contacts, without anything in between. We don't want to be filtering the light between your eyes at all, because when you filter it, then again, you're interfering with those signals. And then during the nighttime, block artificial light. So if you can't turn all the lights off, and we can't because we all have to live and we have to operate, then blocking artificial light with things like blue light blocking glasses. I don't have a pair here on me, but if you block artificial light with blue light blocking glasses or use red, then you're mitigating, or you're minimizing the disruption to your circadian rhythm. And people report sleep improvements, they report their mood improving, they report all kinds of energy improving. So that there are some practical things. That's just touching the surface of it. And if people are interested, I actually run a circadian health course that I've just really recently started that walks people through the practicalities. But a lot to do, but it's also becomes a lifestyle, and it becomes a habit, and it becomes easy after a while.
Amazing. So I wanted to ask you, do we have extraocular photoreceptors? The common narrative is that we don't, right? It's all just through the eyes. Can we absorb light through the skin?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, we can. There are non-visual photoreceptors in the skin. They're in the fat tissue. So that was a discovery in 2017 that we actually have melanopsin inside our white adipose tissue, and that meant that blue light, blue wavelength light, so 480 nanometers, it can actually penetrate through the skin to essentially inform our adipose tissue of what's going on. There's also in our blood vessels, we've got melanopsin in our blood vessels. There's neuropsin all throughout the brain. So yeah, there's non-visual photoreceptors throughout the body. And what this means for the listeners is that we've evolved all these ways of sensing our light environment. And to clarify, so we don't lose anyone, what I mean by non-visual photoreceptor is that a visual photoreceptor is what we use to form an image. So in the rod and cone cells of the retina, we use specific visual photoreceptors to form an image. So I can see Sam sitting in his chair, or I can see the tiger that's about to jump and attack me. So they're image forming or visual photoreceptors, and we need them obviously to be able to do anything to see. But what we also have is non-visual photoreceptors, and these were discovered after a range of experiments. But essentially what they found was that people who lost vision, or I believe mice who lost vision, were still able to respond and have an intact circadian rhythm. So they realized, well, okay, if the animal can still go to sleep at the right time, it can still, poop in the morning, if we can still look for water at the right time, then it's obviously got an intact circadian rhythm, even though it can't see anything. And then they discovered there was a population of cells in the retina that responded intrinsically to light. So it's more just like a detector function, on off, but obviously a gradient detector function. And that were this melanopsin photoreceptor, and it is expressed in a small subset of ganglion cells in the eye, and that is how we program our circadian rhythm. And if anyone's ever unfortunately had to go to the emergency department with a head knock, hit on the head or fallen over, and the ER doc has put the light in your eye, and that he's testing a pupillary light reflex, and that pupillary light reflex is conveyed to the brain by those non-visual photoreceptors firing, and that information or that arm of the reflex relies on melanopsin and those non-visual intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. So the question that Sam asked me was that, do you have those photoreceptors in places other than the eye? And the answer is yes, as I explained earlier. And what this is doing is helping our whole body kind of respond to environmental signals about our light environment to, again, help us program our biology. But the problem is that this can be hijacked now that we're living in a modern environment with blue light. And what I mean by blue is that we get an overload or an excess of isolated blue, because there is blue light in a natural sun, in the natural solar spectrum, but it's always balanced. It's balanced throughout the day with red, and it's always balanced by infrared. So it's never by itself. It's never like a pure. Think about fruit. When you have fruit or fructose in fruit, it's never by itself. You're not drinking a shot of fructose when you eat a piece of fruit. So that's the analogy for what's happening with our light environment. With our light environment today, when you're exposed to an LED downlight or a OLED computer screen, it's like shotting fructose. It's not in the context of what it should be naturally, and that is what is causing disease. So when you're exposed to these artificial blue light sources, it destroys or damages that non-visual photoreceptor system, and it prevents it from regenerating. So that derails our metabolism, it derails our physiology, it causes havoc, and it causes mitochondrial dysfunction. It reduces our ability to make melatonin, which is a really important key antioxidant molecule. So the whole system is just really, really damaged by our light environment. And that's why I tell my patients, you've got to look after your light diet. You can't just look after your food diet. And it's, yes, I want you to eat high quality grass-fed regenerative beef, but I also want you to see the sunrise and to block blue light, because you've got your food diet, but you also have your light diet.
I'm really curious, do you think there are any effects of not having light contacting with areas like, let's say, the genitals or something? Like that's an area that I feel like no one exposes to light. Are there any links, to fertility with that stuff?
That's a very good question, and I believe Paul Saladino has looked at this question, whether men should expose their genitals to the sun, and he found a rat study that saw one of the androgenic hormones increase in the group that was exposed to sun. The answer is, again, let's use the ancestral evolutionary lens. We didn't develop clothing. There was no clothing, 100,000 years ago at all. So that part of the body definitely would have had sun exposure incidentally throughout the day. And what we know is that near infrared light, which again is perceived, but it's mostly perceived as heat, but it makes up half of the light that actually gets to Earth. So half the photons, or approximately, are photons you can't even see, but they're incredibly impactful in their effect, because what they can do is they can penetrate the body about 8 to 10 centimeters, even through clothing, and when we're outside. And the leaves on the trees actually reflect those photons. They reflect them onto our bodies, or reflect them into the environment, and we absorb them. And what happens when you get or collect these near infrared photons is that your body makes melatonin inside the mitochondria of your cells. And like I mentioned melatonin earlier, and essentially there's two pools. Or you can make melatonin in your pineal gland, which is what most of circadian biology associates melatonin production with, and that occurs just after about an hour or two after dark. You get your body makes melatonin when you don't have exposure to blue light or any light, and that helps you rest and recover. But you also make melatonin when you're getting exposed to near infrared inside every one of your cells, and it's a local kind of antioxidant kind of dampening system. And what happens is that when you're outside during the day, you can make this melatonin on exposure to near infrared light. So to answer your question about is there an area that should be exposed? Yes, because you want near infrared to help your body make these substances close to where it needs to. And you also want, even though the near infrared can penetrate through clothing, you do also want some exposure of visual or ultraviolet light as well. And again, I'm not familiar with the exact study, but the onus of proof should be on the person proposing us to hide some part of our body completely from the sun, because that doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, gotcha. Well, it was a pleasure having you on, Dr. Gulhane, and thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Thanks for having me.